The Rings of Power, Amazon's definition of you gotta spend money to make money. I'm not gonna lie, the divisiveness online that has come from this series has left me conflicted. On the one hand, I'm a huge fan of J.R.R. Tolkien and the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings trilogy. The Hobbit is one of my favorite books from childhood, and the movies make me want to go into town and scream at my neighbors to watch them. The Hobbit movies were just okay, so I'm familiar with what a subpar Tolkien property feels like. On the other hand, I am open to new interpretations of the source material, but that comes with limits. Most adaptations today will steer so far outside the realms of the original source material that they end up an unrecognizable mess. It's like your parents tell you that grandma is coming over, only she's wearing a bag on her head and won't stop crying. I don't doubt that Rings of Power will be popular with general audiences, but it remains to be seen how fans of the books, movies, and the Ralph Bakshi community will receive this show. From character design to changes in the lore and a general disregard for the opinions of a huge percentage of the fan base, this series is already behind in winning over the Middle Earth community. I have gripes with this series right off the bat, but I want to treat it fairly. Even though Amazon is responsible for the Wheel of Time adaptation, I won't hold that mess against them. The first episode begins with some children running around that Amazon gathered from its sweatshops. We see a blonde little elf girl making a paper boat, which I guess is what kids did before video games. At this point, though, paper boats just give me Pennywise vibes. You want to float, Georgie? This little girl is a young Galadriel, and she sails the paper boat down a stream. We then get to see some good old fashioned bullying. Are we sure Stephen King didn't write this? The other elf children begin hurling rocks at the paper boat, and Galadriel attacks them because she doesn't like that rock actually beats paper in real life and that the rules of rock, paper, scissors are stupid. I personally don't believe elves would act like this, but Amazon doesn't care about my opinions. Galadriel is interrupted from kicking elf ass by her brother Finrod, who we find out taught her this hobby so others would bully her. Finrod tells Galadriel some of his weird theories about stones being evil and ships being good, which, if you've ever had a pet rock or seen Pirates of the Caribbean, you know isn't strictly true. Finrod foreshadows his own death by saying he won't always be here, and Galadriel contradicts that by saying they had no words for death yet. I guess Finrod could predict the future, and the writers think we are stupid. Then we get to see the real reason this show has a chance of standing out: all the money put into the visuals. I can't even estimate how much cruelty and torture there must have been in Amazon's VFX department to make these landscape and city shots. Although I get the same feeling staring at a picture of Henry Cavill. So maybe they should have just made the buildings out of pictures of his face. However, we quickly see that the elves aren't allowed to have any nice things. Darkness corrupts the light as the evil Valar, Morgoth, decides that the elves have stayed up way past their bedtime. The elves think that rules are dumb and leave Valinor so they don't have to go to bed. A war begins in Middle Earth over sleepy time, and we see a fell beast very brutally burn a great eagle alive, because that is exactly what kids were hoping to have nightmares about tonight. Finrod appears to be having a bit of a mental breakdown, because he loves fried chicken, but isn't allowed to have any because he's vegan. He cries because he no longer gets to be in the show. An older Galadriel tells us that this war lasted centuries, because no one had anything better to do. But thankfully, she discovered a new hobby, besides making boats. Now she collects helmets and puts them into a really big pile for dramatic effect. I'm sure she won't be bullied for doing that. We find out Morgoth is defeated. Yay, we can all go home! Except that Morgoth's second in command, Sauron, and the orcs are still out there somewhere. You'd think it would have been someone's job not to let them get away. Oh well. Finrod will have no problem dealing with them. We then cut to Finrod lying dead on a table. We see that Sauron gave him an amateur tattoo before he died, which is just the letter E. Maybe it was supposed to be the word elf, but Finrod died before it could be finished. Galadriel cries a tear for her brother, because he died before giving her the $20 he owed her. She then does some light grave robbing and steals his dagger, hoping that selling it could recoup some of her losses. What's even crazier is that all of that backstory and history I just went over is only 8 minutes of the 1 hour runtime of the first episode. Amazon must have been really scared of a lawsuit, which I kind of hope happens. Galadriel says that she is going to go hunting, but does not bring any beer or firearms, so I don't believe her. The show cuts to Galadriel and her band of elves mountain climbing, so I guess she took up another hobby. The elves climb the mountain like a man would with picks, even though they don't need to, maybe to make it more challenging for them. I saw Legolas walk on top of snow. That's basically walking on water, like Jesus. And these elves need to climb a mountain with tools. Go back to writing school, writers. We are then introduced to Thondir, or as I call him, Mr. Always Wrong. He says that they should camp for the night, and then return to the High King in the morning. He probably should have said that before climbing the mountain, but whatever. Galadriel ignores him, and they keep going through a blizzard. One of the elves falls in the snow, exhausted. Even though this elf isn't dead yet, Galadriel decides it's her time, and tries to shroud her still alive body with a cloak to not weaken morale any further. Mr. Always Wrong says they won't find the stronghold, but we literally see they already are there a few seconds later. The elves then enter the abandoned orc stronghold, and we see that this place is so evil, the laws of thermodynamics do not apply to their torches. Galadriel punches through a wall of solid ice. Okay. And she shrugs off the pain of breaking all her fingers. We see what happens when you use orcs as wallpaper, and to the surprise of no one, Mr. Always Wrong is wrong again. He says what happened here is lost to the ages, and Galadriel rediscovers Sauron's trail before he's even finished saying his line. Mr. Always Wrong says they should consult the High King before going further, but if you couldn't tell by his name, Galadriel knows to do the exact opposite. We then discover that these elves are trespassing on a frost troll's property, and like any homeowner would, it attacks them. 7 battle-hardened elves are easily beaten by the troll, and Galadriel kills him single-handedly without any help or injuries. Galadriel commands her subordinates to continue going along with this bullshit, and they all decide to mutiny. It was around there that I started to miss Cate Blanchett. This depiction of Galadriel is abrasive and obsessive. She's kind of like emo Peter Parker in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3. Except he was infected by an alien, and this is just how she is all the time. The show cuts to a few men with antlers on their backs, who are dressed like modern day homeless people. They are spooked because they keep seeing things, and I think that's just the power of drugs. We see that it is not a drug induced hallucination, and that the grass is filled with little people. The children of the corn start to pop up out of the grass until the signal is given, and we see that these little creatures are as good at camouflage as green berets. These are Harfoots, hobbits that are not called that due to a technicality and more legal reasons. The only significant difference is that they have grass in their hair, live in mossy tents, and eat snails. We are introduced to Nori and a berry obsessed group of children that are following her. We also meet Nori's best friend named Poppy. These two will be this show's Frodo and Sam. We see an almost uncomfortable amount of berry eating, like the director has some sort of fetish, and Nori discovers that there is a wolf close by. Sadly, we do not get to see the strange looking wolf eat any Harfoot children, because this is not a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood. After the Harfoots are introduced, we get to see what this show has done to Elrond. Look at how they've massacred my boy! Instead of a warrior and powerful lord, he has been changed into a politician. God, no! A few elves come over to him while he is writing a speech and tell him Galadriel is back. He is excited, but we, the audience, are left wondering why. Elrond meets his future mother in law, and he starts describing all of the traits that do not make her Cate Blanchett. Galadriel calls Elrond a politician, which I know was written by someone who desperately wanted to write for House of the Dragon, but got stuck doing this. Galadriel demands to speak to the High King, which I didn't know someone who wasn't a king could do. Elrond tells her everyone is kind of peeved at her for acting entitled and not following orders. And I'm stuck here wondering why a character that's supposed to be the definition of likable is written to be so disliked by everyone around her and myself. The show then cuts to Nori's father, a guy that looks far too pleased with the act of sharpening a knife. We also meet Nori's mother, and the only woman in the village crazy enough to marry a serial killer. We see that she is chastising Nori for her curiosity and for being a typical fantasy protagonist. The cliche of a young character wanting to explore the outside world and being told no by an authority figure is almost suffocatingly present in this scene. Why anybody's parents in fantasy can't support their children's dreams is beyond me. We cut back to the High King of the Elves, delivering the speech Elrond wrote to honor the elves that deserve praise, and Galadriel. During the ceremony, the king puts a circlet on Galadriel's head and then verbally gives her the middle finger by telling her he will be forcing her to go back home. The show then cuts to fireworks over the city, which aren't as impressive as the ones in Fellowship. And we see that Galadriel is mourning a tree in the shape of her brother. Elrond stands behind her, breathing like an orc apparently, and Galadriel continues to be a downer by bringing up all of their dead friends. Galadriel says that she will refuse the gift of her king of going back home, which Elrond rightfully points out is a really stupid idea. Galadriel says that she will find Sauron alone if she has to, and Elrond, who has the patience of a saint, tells her that this is also a bad idea. How can a character so right about what's coming be so wrong in her approach? Galadriel says the word conflicted funny, and tells Elrond that he couldn't possibly understand how she feels. Elrond says he's been through pretty much the same thing she has, and she continues to play the I've suffered more than you game. The next scene is a village of men that was probably just leftover footage from the Wheel of Time series. Here we see two figures with cloaks enter the village and one goes into a bar. In the bar, we find out one of these figures is an elf named Arondir, and everyone glares at him because he always stinks up their bathroom. He exchanges looks with a human woman, and she leaves because she doesn't want to be there when the farting starts. One of the villagers calls Arondir a derogatory term, knife ears, which sounds cooler than is insulting, and asks when the elves are going to leave them alone. Arondir says the past is with us all, which is a cryptic way of saying probably never. The angry villager is offered some booze by the bartender, but he smashes it on the ground. The bartender almost punches the angry villager, but Arondir stops him because he doesn't want the bartender to hurt his hand. Arondir picks up the cup awkwardly, and then he leaves to find another bathroom. But before that, he does what he thinks is flirting. Outside is the woman from earlier in the scene. She hands him a vial, and we find out that she's his drug dealer. The two somehow have sexual tension with no actual chemistry, and it's actually fascinating to watch what the actors were told to try to do. Arondir says the equivalent of I don't like sand to her multiple different ways until they are interrupted by the bartender. The two are startled when he sees them talking, even though no normal human being would consider what they were doing as anything but boring conversation. We see that Arondir's friend is an elf that somehow forgot to bring any arrows or a sword, so he is basically useless. Arondir says he smells like rotten leaves, which is just the smell of fall. A great insult. Arondir's partner tells him interspecies breeding is not advisable, but Arondir still needs that hookup for seeds. On the way back to the fort, it turns out they have all been laid off by the High King and are gonna go home. Arondir stares at the landscape and is conflicted because he loves drugs but also hates being there. A new elf shows up and asks what he used to do before the war. Arondir says he was a grower, not a shower. This new elf is racist against humans and leaves Arondir to consider his racist thoughts. Meanwhile, the drug dealer, Bronwyn, is cooking up a new batch, while her son, Theo, grinds up the powder. Hopefully, they don't make the mistake of getting high on their own supply. Arondir feels the itch and decides to show up at her house to find more drugs and more awkward conversation. Theo is not pleased his mom is talking to the town bathroom destroyer, but the two stare at each other strangely until they are interrupted by a farmer. One of his cows is making black tar heroin, and the two go off together in search of the source to monetize it. After, we see that Theo has a dirty little secret. He has what appears to be Sauron's tattoo machine. It has his insignia on it and everything. A cut to Galadriel sailing on a boat in armor made from discarded tuna fish cans. The scene quickly fades to Elrond, who is trying to mimic her resting bitch face. Elrond asks the High King why they would send her away, and he says that her personality would alienate viewers. The High King pairs Elrond up with Celebrimbor, who looks like my grandma. We cut back to the Harfoots, with Nori scaring the crap out of a Harfoot named Sadok. He asks if she's part squirrel, and the furry community is already considering it. Sadok says the skies are strange, which I've only heard people say when they're high. Speaking of high, we cut back to the most forced relationship in the show. Dealers should never get involved with customers until they discover the village they were looking for is on fire. There is yet another cut back to Galadriel, and we see some elf women begin to undress them, probably for an orgy. Galadriel is reluctant to give up her brother's weapon, as she hasn't found someone to buy it yet. But one rule that heaven and orgies share is that there are no weapons allowed. Suddenly, a bright light begins to engulf the elves, but Galadriel can't let that $20 go, and she jumps into the water. Even without a ship, and the almost 100% chance that she will drown, $20 is still $20. Meanwhile, a meteorite flies through the sky, and Nori goes to investigate it. Nori is surrounded by fire, and before she knows it, she sees a naked old man in the fetal position. The end. Well, that was episode 1, and I have to be honest, I'm not really feeling it so far. I say this not as someone who wants to gripe on minor details. If Amazon wanted to change the personalities of beloved characters, they really should have done a better job than this. They should have the elves act like elves, not forcing them to have the same moral failings as men. This Galadriel constantly acts hateful and is fueled by revenge. Why change so much about the personality and the history of a character so many people love and just give us a ripoff of Arya Stark? I love Arya Stark, but I'm disappointed because I wanted to see Galadriel. Some of these choices just feel like a way to make the community fight within each other for clicks, and I think that's kind of scummy. Sadly, a lot of this just feels like another fantasy TV show. A show with great visuals and a lot of potential, but just a show. All I could think after watching it was, where is the special feeling this world is supposed to foster?